Oh boy, we have an extra exciting section for you. This is a section that I absolutely love. I got into programming because of web development. And in this section, we're going to explore how we can use Python in web development. And actually, the way we use Python in web development will also work with mobile development. And this is a really exciting field because, well, as you're aware, there's lots of web applications. There's lots of mobile applications. And using Python, we can actually help build these applications. In this section, I'm going to give you a general overview of web development, what that involves, how websites actually work, how browsers work. We're also going to use Python to build our own server, our own portfolio webpage, where people can view our portfolios and actually submit maybe a request to work with you or send you a message and actually store it in places like a database. So by the end of this section, you're going to have your own portfolio website that is live and in production. It's going to be a very, very fun one. But in order for us to learn how we can use Python, we need to first understand how the web works. So in the next video, let's learn how the web works. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. So how do websites work? Now, I have an entire web development course, so because this is a Python course, we're not going to go super deep into this topic. Instead, we're going to focus on the Python side of things. But I do want to help you understand what we're building and how everything works, because hopefully by the end of this course, you're able to actually change your portfolio, update your portfolio to your own liking, and showcase the projects that we've built throughout the course. So I have a website for you here. We have XKCD, which is just a little funny comic website. If I click refresh here or enter this URL, I'm taken to this website. But how does this actually work? How is my browser, in this case, Google Chrome, able to display this web page for me? I need to be connected to the internet, right? So there's some sort of data that's being transferred for me to be able to see this. So let's explore how this works. And look at that. I created a nice little diagram for you. And in this diagram, I'm going to attempt to just tell you exactly how it works. It's quite simple. We have our browser right here, which can be Google Chrome, it could be Safari, it could be Firefox. It doesn't matter. This browser, we're able to type into it a website or maybe Google for a website and then click on a website. When we click on a website, what happens is that through internet, the browser makes a request all the way to another machine. And this machine, which we call a server, is located anywhere in the world. It doesn't really matter. Because through our internet network, the browser is going to say, hey, this website, who owns that website? Or which machine can serve me the files for that website? And using some complex logic, it's going to find this server, which at the end of the day is just a computer, and we're actually going to show you and deploy our own server. Well, it simply says, hey, give me some data, because without data, I'm not able to display anything on a web page. And the server, well, first of all, they communicate over something called HTTP and HTTPS. Because the browser and the server are two different machines, right? The browser is on my laptop right now. And the machine, which is a server, it can be anywhere in the world, they need to communicate some way. And we need a rule to say, we don't want all these machines talking to each other with no rules in place. For example, we can agree that when we communicate between you and I'm going to speak in English. In the same way, HTTP and HTTPS, which is a secured, encrypted version of communication, allows me to say, hey, can you give me the data? And the server to understand, oh, this website or this browser needs the data that I have. if I go back to this website over here, you see that I'm using HTTPS. And it's saying I want to use the HTTPS protocol, that is the language, to communicate that I want to go to this website. So as soon as I hit enter, it's going to make that request all the way to a server somewhere. And then the server is going to respond with this data. Let's continue with our diagram. So the request has just been made. This server just happens to have 3 files that we need. One is an HTML file, and this file is the text or content of the website. The other one is the CSS file, and this contains all the styling of the website. So that is colors, maybe some fonts, maybe the position of the elements, anything to do with style so it doesn't look like a boring piece of text. And then we have JavaScript. JavaScript is what gives websites behavior. When I log into Facebook or maybe tweet something on Twitter, JavaScript is allowing me to perform those actions. Because with just HTML and CSS, we just have text and some pretty styling. With JavaScript, we're able to take actions. But we don't need to focus on that too much. All we need to know is that the server, because it's a computer, on its files has these 3 files for us. And these 3 files, what happen, get sent to the browser. Because the browser was really, really kind and asked, hey, can you give me data? And the server says, sure, here it is, and sends us these 3 files. And these 3 files, when they get sent back, the browser understands them. And because it understands them, even though to us it may look like gibberish, it's able to display that website for us. But let me ask you a question. Up until now, I haven't really talked about Python. I thought this was a Python course, Andre. Why are you telling me all this stuff that I don't care about? Well, because in here, there's one piece that can actually be written in Python. Can you guess what that is? If you guessed the server, congratulations. You get 5,000 points. You see, the browser is something that, well, it's an application we download on our computer, right? But up until now, the server was kind of a mystery box, a machine, a computer somewhere. But Python programmers can actually write the logic and the rules that servers can act upon. So all this communication of, hey, can you give me data, can be interpreted in Python and then send this data to the browser using Python. And we're going to build our own server over the next couple of videos, but also touch upon these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files so we can actually display something like a website. Now, I want to finish off this video with one question. Do you think that this server has to be written in Python? What do you think? No, it doesn't, right? The browser doesn't care what this machine is like. All it cares about is these 3 files. And because we're speaking in this HTTPS protocol, the browser says, hey, I don't care what language you speak, I don't care anything, I'm just going to tell you through this HTTPS, just give me the data that I want. And we can do whatever logic we want in here. I can send emails from here if I want. I can send text messages. I can do math operations. I can play a game on this computer if I want. It doesn't really matter. As long as I am able to send these files back to the browser. So we can do that with Python, but we can do that with other languages like Node, like PHP, like Java. So we can write a server in any type of language. The only thing we can't really do is on the browser side. On the browser side, we have to use these 3 files because, well, at least in general terms, it can only understand JavaScript, which is another programming language. All right, let's explore this topic a little bit more in the next video. In the previous video, we learned that a browser simply sends a request to a server somewhere in the world over internet using the HTTPS protocol, and then it receives those JavaScript, HTML, and CSS files so that it's able to display a website. Now, how can we actually check this? Well, I can actually go to View, Developer, and this is using Google Chrome. So I recommend for this part to use Google Chrome so you can follow what I'm doing. If I go to Developer Tools here, it's going to open up a little box here with some information for me. Now, what I want to focus on is this Network tab. And this Network tab is going to tell us what type of information we receive from the server. If I refresh here, you'll notice that I get some data here. Now, you want to make sure that there's no filter involved. So we want to say over here that we want everything. So there's no filter, everything, there's no searching going on. And we can refresh again. And all right, we see a lot more files. But this looks intimidating. Let's think about what we just learned. We learned that we first get an HTML file, which happens to be this one. It says over here, type document. And if I click over here, this is an HTML document. So the response from the server, when I hit refresh, remember, it communicated to a server somewhere in the world that had these files on that computer. And here we have our HTML file. If I'll scroll down, look at that. We can see over here the webcomic of romance, sarcasm, math, and language, which is right over here. Remember how I said HTML is the text that gets displayed on a website? Well, this is our HTML here that the server responded with. And the browser knows how to read this and display the text. What about the CSS? Well, I can actually click on this CSS tab here, and it'll show me all the CSS files that came from the server. And you see over here that this, again, looks a little bit different. It's in a different syntax than an HTML, but all it does here is it gives me the styles that I want. You can see over here, we can pick background color, we can pick different position, width, left position, and this gives us the styling that we want on a website. And then if we go to JavaScript, we actually see the JavaScript files that this website uses. Now, we don't have to worry about JavaScript here. JavaScript allows us to do some interactivity on this website that, for now, we probably don't need to worry about. Now, I do want to point out that there's a few other things in here, like image and media. And as you can see, images, we definitely have some images in here that we are using. If I click on preview, we can see the images. But at the end of the day, the concept is the same. We have an HTML file, which in our case is right over here. You see how the HTML file is displayed without CSS, which is just the textual data. We have the CSS, which is the styling of our page, and then some JavaScript to make our page interactive, and maybe some images. But at the end of the day, all these things are actually just textual data that we receive from the server. So that means that in order for us to be able to build our website, we need to create these three things: an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. Actually, we don't even need a JavaScript file if we don't want any interactivity. We don't even need a CSS file if we don't want any styling. We can even just use an HTML file. So in the next video, we're going to build our first website. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's build our first website. Now, I've already created a folder called Web Server because this is going to be our web server for now. And inside of this web server, we have an index.html file, which will be the extension for creating an HTML file. We have script.js, which is the extension for writing JavaScript, just like we have .py for writing Python. And then we have style.css for writing CSS styles. Now, in this section, I'm going to be using Sublime Text and my iTerm terminal, but you can use whatever developer tool that you want. I like using these ones just for the screen recordings. They help because, well, it's nice and clean. It doesn't give me too many hints so that I can also make errors and show you along as I make errors how I fix them. But again, you can use Visual Studio Code, whatever you prefer. Now, you see over here that all these files are empty. But remember, a web server simply gives these 3 files to a browser so that the browser can display the page. So let's start off with HTML. How do we write HTML? Well, Sublime Text actually lets me do something interesting here. If I type in HTML and then hit Tab, it autofills it for me. All right, I kind of cheated, but hey, I don't want to bore you to death. So this is a standard HTML file. Because I have the .html extension, if I have this type of syntax, I can write HTML. And it's not that difficult. We have opening tags and closing tags with the backslash here. So we have the head of the website with the title. So this is what appears on the tab. So let's say my website. Very creative. So that's the head, and then the body. This is what gets displayed on a website. So in here, I can say, I am a webmaster. Just like that. And we've created our HTML file. Now, check this out. If I now open index.html, if I right click here and let's say open in new window, or you can even just go and double click this file. So if I double click this, look at that. I am a webmaster. Just simple text, nothing too crazy, but I've just created my first website. Let's continue with CSS. CSS has a different syntax than HTML. CSS syntax goes something like this. We can give it what HTML element we want to add some styling to. In our case, let's say body. And I can say body, then curly brackets. And in here, I want to have background, let's say color. And we'll go with, let's go with green. If I save this and I refresh the page, nothing happened. And this is a little small detail that, again, this isn't a web development course, so we don't need to worry too much about. But essentially, the very first thing that happens is that the HTML file gets sent, and the HTML file is actually the only thing that gets read by the browser. So within the HTML file, I have to say, hey, HTML, by the way, we also have a CSS file. Can you also use that in the website? So we can do that in the head tag by using something called a link tag. So a link tag, we can actually remove some of this. We simply have to say, hey, it's a type of text, CSS, and it has something called href. Href simply says, hey, where is this file located? In our case, because it's in the same folder as our index.html, we can simply say it's style.css because, well, just look for style.css and that's where the style file is. And now, if you remember, we also had the relationship style sheet that we need to include. I just removed it so that we can see what we're writing over here. So if we do style sheet, and this is just something, a syntax that you have to get used to if you want to include a CSS file. If I save this and go back and refresh, hey, look at that. My ugly website, let's make it a little bit bigger. My ugly website with a green background color now has some style. If I open up the developer tools once again, and I hit refresh, look at that. I get an HTML file and a CSS file. Awesome. So I just created my own web server, right? We could even write JavaScript here, but again, this isn't a JavaScript course, so we don't need to worry about it. In this case, here you go. I just wrote some JavaScript, which this is kind of like writing print in Python. If I refresh the page one more time, again, JavaScript file doesn't get displayed because, well, we have to, again, tell index.html that we need a JavaScript file. And usually, JavaScript files are contained in a script tag, usually at the bottom of the body. So let's close that. And then in here, instead of using the href, we just have to say src for source. And then once again, where's the JavaScript file? It's at script.js. So if I save this and I refresh the page, look at that. We're now loading the script.js file. And all it's doing is if we click on the console tab is, there you go. It printed something in the console, and console is something that JavaScript uses. But all we care about is that we're able to serve these 3 files. What we've done is created our very first server. But you may have noticed something. When you went up over here, look at the URL path that we have. That's not what you usually type into a website, right? I mean, we saw that the website over here, xkcd.com, well, has the .com, uses HTTP. That's a real URL, right? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that we didn't actually create a real web server, because all we've done is we've served to the browser some files from, as you can see, from our computer. So all it's doing is the browser saying, hey, I'm going to display these files that are located right here on your computer. So essentially, we have a web server that's also running a browser, but that's not how real life works. Why would that be? Well, imagine if you had your own website. Do you really want to have people from all over the world access your website directly through your computer? Grabbing the files from your computer? I mean, no, right? There's a lot of security issues. There's a lot of issues with performance. You have to keep your laptop on the entire time so people can access your website. Instead, we want a web server, which, as the name suggests, serves files and specializes in serving files to browsers somewhere in the world that I don't have to worry about. It's not on my computer. Somebody owns that machine. Somebody owns that computer. And it's on all the time so that whenever we go to a website or a link, it's always going to be running and sending those files out. So we're finally going to get back to Python here. Because what we want to do is do something more sophisticated than just having these files on our machine. Instead, we want to build a real server using Python that we can deploy so that people can access our website anywhere in the world. Now, you might still be confused. This whole process might not make complete sense to you because we're just getting started. But don't worry, by the end of it all, it's all going to make sense. So let's forget about the browser for now and get into building a real server. Something more sophisticated than what we've done up until now, which is just a folder with these 3 files, and we just double click on index.html. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. It's time to use Python and build our real server. Now, what should we do here first? Your first intuition might say, I wonder if Python has a module already for that. Well, if you actually Google Python HTTP server, you see that, oh, look at that. Python seems to have an HTTP server. Awesome. And this module actually allows us to create a server. You can see over here that all we need to do is use the HTTP server, and, well, we have ourselves a server. You can actually read through the documentation and see how you can build one. You can see over here, for example, that it's a simple couple of lines to create a server. However, if I scroll all the way up, there's a warning here. HTTP server is not recommended for production. It only implements basic security checks. You see, building servers is a very, very common thing. A lot of Python developers are hired as backend engineers to build things like servers. So when we use something like the HTTP server that's built in as part of the Python standard library, well, we're redoing all these things that, frankly, a lot of developers have done before. And when you have a problem that is constantly getting solved, or the problem is constantly being rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, we start to have something called libraries, but also something called frameworks. That is, instead of using something that, well, frankly, would take us a really long time to do, and as you can see here, there's still a lot of issues like security issues that we need to check and fix, we can use a framework like Flask to build a server, because so many engineers are building servers using Python. Flask is a tool that uses, perhaps underneath the hood, something like HTTP server, but instead make sure that the security, the added tools and benefits are already pre-built for us. You can think of it as a kitchen. You're trying to bake a cake, and instead of you having to go buy the knife, go buy the bowl, the mixer, the oven, go buy the ingredients, all that stuff, Flask is like the kitchen where you get to enter the kitchen, you have all the tools necessary, you have the ingredients, and all you have to do is cook. Now, when it comes to Python, there's two really popular frameworks. There's the Flask framework and the Django framework, right over here. Now, Django is one of those frameworks that it's really, really big. It's a big, big kitchen. On the other hand, Flask is what we call a micro framework. That is, it's extremely lean. It's a small library so that we can do things fast. I'm going to teach Flask over the next couple of videos because I like the simplicity of it all. Sometimes when you write in Django, it feels like you're not even writing Python because there's so many rules and so many tools that you can use. Versus with Flask, everything is clean and small, and it's great for our use. So how do we get started? Well, as you know by now, as with any tool that we use, we should read the documentation, right? And in our case, we can just go to installation and actually read through and see what they recommend. You see over here that they recommend we use a virtual environment, something that we've already talked about in previous lesson. And you'll see why this is important when we actually deploy the project to production. But it looks like we first create an environment, so we make a directory, a project directory, which hopefully we already have. And then we create a virtual environment. Now, one thing I haven't told you is that if you use Python 3, which if you're following this course, you already are using, it comes pre-built with something called venv. So instead of pipenv or virtual env that I've talked about in the previous video on virtual environments, this comes pre-built. So we can actually just run this command in our terminal. So let's give it a go. And look at that. A new virtual environment folder was just created. Now, you see over here that the virtual environment was created, well, in a new folder called venv. If we actually leave out the first part, or the last venv, or actually, let's go back one directory and simply say Python 3-m venv, and then say web server. The web server now becomes the virtual environment because we already have the folder built. So we don't want a new folder called virtual environment. We can just delete that and instead have the virtual environment right over here. Now, it also gives you the option on how to do it on Windows. So again, on Windows, you might have to run py-3. Or if you're using Python 2 and you don't have the venv module, in that case, well, you have to use virtual environment. And then finally, we have to activate the environment. And all we need to do, if you're on a Mac or Linux, is just grab this code, or on Windows, grab this. So let's just copy and paste this. If I paste it in here, let's talk about what it's doing. Here, we have to change this to where our folder is. In our case, we're doing the web server, right? So I'm going to say web /space server, because, well, that's the folder that we want to go into from desktop. And inside of the bin folder, right here, we have the activate executable. So all we're saying is, hey, run this executable. We don't need to worry about what it does, but if I run this, we get a bit of an error. Now, the issue here is that I'm using something called a fish shell. And the reason I'm showing you this is because everybody's machine is different. So whether you're on Windows or Mac or Linux, or maybe you're using a different type of terminal, you might get these errors. Now, the best way to solve these is if you go to the VNV Python module, and if you scroll all the way down, you'll see here that you can activate using certain scripts, but depends on which shell you're using. Most of you are using PowerShell in Windows or Bash if you're using a Mac. In my case, I'm using this, fish. So all I need to do is actually add this .fish at the end of my script. You'll notice here that you might have to add different things based on what you're using. So if you're on Windows, you're most likely going to add .bat or .ps1. So let's try that again. I'm going to run the same thing, but this time say .fish. There you go. It's now working, and I am in the web server, which is this folder in the virtual environment. So now I can install packages here and just be in my own little world. Now, if for some reason activating doesn't work for you, you can actually still keep going with the lectures. It won't really affect you. This is just one of those things that it's a little tricky. You might not get it straight away, but the best thing to do is to always read the documentation and follow the instructions. All right, that took an unnecessarily long time. So let's finish off by installing Flask. If we go back to our guide, we can finally install Flask by doing pip install Flask. Now again, we want to make sure that our pip, if we do version, is for Python 3.7. But for some of you, you might have to use pip 3. So based on your needs, make sure you use the appropriate pip installer. Let's clear this. And just copy and paste and install Flask. Awesome. We've just installed Flask, so we can start using it in our project. But that was a whole lot of setup and a lot of downloading, so let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh boy, wasn't that last lesson super fun with all that installation and setup and errors? Hopefully things will be a lot better as we move along. That was, I'd say, the hardest part. We're back here at the Flask framework, and the next thing we want to do is we want to go to the Quick Start Guide. And I know I could just code along and show you exactly how it is, but I really want to show you the process of how you work as a developer, because once you're done with this course, you're going to be out in the world and you should know how to learn something new. Let's say at the next job, somebody says, hey, I want you to use Django instead of Flask. How do you learn it? Well, you read the documentation. So I just clicked on the Quick Start because I just want to build a server really quick. And you see here that the minimal application is, well, it looks like this. So let's just copy the code from here and we'll talk about it line by line, don't worry. So I'm going to close off these index files, the script files, and the CSS files. We're in our virtual environment. Let's clear this. And we can actually just create a new file. So in our web server, let's just say new file, and I'm going to say server.py. So we have a new Python file, and we're going to copy and paste that code. So we're installing, or we already installed Flask, so I'm going to import Flask from Flask. And then we do this funny thing called app equals Flask, and we use the Flask class to instantiate an app. And we do this underscore underscore name. Now, when something is confusing, I always like knowing what's happening. So I'm just going to run underscore underscore name here and actually just print it up so we know what it is. And for now, let's just comment out the bottom part of this. Just click save. I want to find out what this name is. So let's see if we can run this file. I'm going to say Python 3 and simply say server.py. Oh, and we're in the desktop right now, so let's cd into web server. Let's clear and run that again. So Python 3 server.py. And there you go. So our name in this case is main. And why is that? Well, because this is the main file that we're running. This shouldn't really be a surprise, right? So we've created an instance of a Flask app, or set up our Flask app. And this is our app. And when we run it from our command line, it sets the name as the main. So that's the name of our app, essentially. All right, so we've created our app, our Flask app, and then we see that we're using, what is this? This is a decorator, right? We learned about this. Again, one of the cool things about frameworks is that they give you what we call a higher level of abstraction. That means we don't necessarily need to know what this is doing, what the code is doing underneath. We just know that this app.route decorator gives us some extra tools for us to build a server. In this case, it's going to say anytime we hit slash, or what we call the root, I want you to define a function called hello world and return hello world. But let's go back to the documentation. Now, one thing I want to note here is that when you call your Python file, make sure you don't call it flask.py because this would actually conflict with Flask itself. So name it server.py or hello.py, whatever you want, just in case you get that error. Now, the next part is to actually run our application, our Flask application. Now, there's one other trick here that we need to do. We need to run the Flask run command. So Flask also gives us a command line run to actually run our server. But we also see here that we need to export. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We need to export Flask app equals to hello.py. And as you can see here, we just need to give it that environment variable. So Flask app, just like this. And if you're on Windows or PowerShell, it shows you what commands to run. Again, I'll link to this resource so that you can copy and paste as well. In my case, I'll just do export. So copy and paste here. And instead of hello.py, I'm going to name it server.py. And then we can do Flask run. Now, another option is to actually do Python-m Flask run. But since we created a virtual environment, we should be able to run Flask run. All right. We get a little warning. This is a development server. Do not use it in production deployment. All right, that's good. We don't need to worry about it because we're not doing production right now. This is just something on our computers. And you see here that it's running on HTTP 127.0.0.1. This is the standard. It's what we call a local host. This is the URL or the address of the laptop I'm working on. And for you, that's the same thing with port 5000. So if I copy this and open this up, what? Look at that. Are you kidding me? We just created our server with hello world. Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from this, right? The slash says, hey, anytime we do the root directory, so this is like saying here, slash here. Anytime the browser requests for this endpoint, it's going to hit our server, and look at that, it's actually logging out that 127.0.01, which is us. We logged this entry, the app route is going to say, hey, somebody needs some of our resources, some files, some data. What should we do? Well, we have this hello world function that we're going to run, and we're going to run by returning hello world. That's right, we just created our very first server. Just to prove that I'm not making this up, let's put your own name on it, refresh, and I'm refreshing and it's not working. And that is because you see here that I'm actually making these requests, but the changes haven't been saved. We actually have to do Control or Command C, let's clear, and run the server again. So now, if I refresh, look at that. Now that's really cool. And I also want to show you that, see here how it says serving Flask app server.py? Remember when we ran the command, this, where we used Flask app equals server.py? This is what it's saying. We are able to do what we call an environmental variable and set Flask app, which is going to get displayed here, as server.py. So I could have called our app whatever we want. So if I go back here and just say super duper, and I run, you see that my Flask app is named super duper. Now, the other thing I don't like is the fact that every time I make a change, I have to restart the server. And you can see here that the debug mode is off. I can actually turn on the debug mode by doing something like this. Once again, we use the environment variable, and if we go to debug mode in our documentation here, you can see here that if we do flask env equals development, which again, instead of the Flask app, we'll say env equals development, and I run this again, you see that I'm now in the debug mode on. This is something that we use, again, just Flask specific, to make sure that it's in development mode. And what this does is, watch this, as I change this and save it, I go back and refresh. And I get an error. Again, this is one of the cool things with the debugger. So if I make this a little smaller, I get an error saying, hey, could not import super duper. Well, that's because I just changed the name from super duper, but it's actually trying to import this server.py, and well, we should probably name it server.py because it doesn't work. I only changed it just to show you what it does. So we can actually fix that. Again, the debug mode, as you can see, gives us a lot of information. So I'm going to close the server, fix my silly name from superduper to server.py. All right, we're all good. And then we're going to Flask run. All right, let's go back and refresh. And there you go. Everything is all good. But the cool part is that now, if I change this to just hello, save, notice how the server noticed the changes. You see over here, it detected changes and automatically changed things for me. So if I refresh, look at that. I don't have to restart the server and everything is working. Awesome. We have our basic server, but we still have a bit more to go because we want to get to the point where we can actually serve important information like HTML files, CSS files, and JavaScript files. Let's explore that a little bit more in the next video. Welcome back. So we have our, well, frankly, really boring website, but we've created our server. But what else can we do? A server usually accepts a request from the browser, right? Now, up until now, we've done what we call a root route. That is the home route, because in here, we haven't written anything. But sometimes in a website, you might see something like blog, right? And if I hit enter, you see that not found. The URL was not found on the server. Again, that's because right now our server is only waiting to hear for the root request. But if we type something like blog, well, there's no function here that cares about that, so it sees that there's nothing to care about and moves on. So let's create a blog route as well. I'm going to copy and paste and just say that, hey, we want to listen to the blog endpoint. This is going to be called, let's call it blog, and say, these are my thoughts on blogs. If I save, again, we have the debugger mode, so I don't need to restart. If I refresh now, look at that. These are my thoughts on blogs. And if I go to the root directory, I get hello. We now have multiple routes. How cool is that? By the way, if we open up the developer tools, go to developer tools, open up the network and just refresh here, you see that we're getting a document. Ignore this part. This is just the developer tools and the plugins that I have. But this is what we get back. We just get a simple document, a response, which is a text. And if I go to headers and I actually scroll down, you see that I requested this URL. I got a status of 200. And I see here that the content type that the server responded with was something called text HTML. Now, this is something that Flask does for us. You see over here that I just sent a string, but Flask automatically converts that to HTML so that the browser can understand it. As a matter of fact, if I go to Elements here, you see here that I have my HTML with a body of hello inside of it. So that's something that we get automatically, which is really, really nice. But now we can start doing some really neat things. For example, let's create another route. And this time, let's say I want the blog from, let's say, 2020 about dogs. Can I do that? Well, yeah, absolutely. Let's say blog 2. And this says, this is my dog. Very engaging blog post there. So now, if I go back, I do blog. All right, I get that. If I do blog 2020, let's say dogs, I get this is my dog. Awesome. So I can have multiple routes like this. What if I remove this and have 2 blogs with the same endpoint? If we go back and just go to blog, I get these are my thoughts on blogs. Because once it hits a route that it sees, which on line 9 it sees, it's going to automatically just return and forget about the rest. So let's bring our dog's blog post back. But you know what's a shame? Because we have this beautiful website, I'm being sarcastic here, this beautiful HTML website that we've created with CSS and JavaScript. Wouldn't it be nice if instead of me just sending out text, I can actually send those? Could I do that? Well, yeah, you can. You see, Flask has another thing called render_template. And this render template function is going to allow us to actually send the HTML file. So let's say the home route now, instead of hello, is going to do something different. Instead, it's going to run the render template function that comes with Flask. And in here, we give it the HTML file that we have. So we can give it a route, in our case, because it's in the same folder as the server file, we can just do index.html. If I run this, let's see if this works. If I go back to my home route, I get an error. Let's read the error. Template not found, index.html. So it tried to look for index.html and it didn't find it. That's not good, is it? What if we do a // which means current directory, grab the index.html. If I save and refresh, I still get the error. Again, this is another thing that you'd have to just learn as you read the documentation. the reason that this is not working is because Flask automatically, when you say render template, tries to look in a folder called templates. So let's create that. I'm going to say new folder, call it templates, and put all my HTML files, in this case, the single HTML file that I have, I'm going to say move, and put it in the templates folder. So now it's in here, and let's save, go back, and refresh. And look at that. I am a webmaster. Everything is working. If I go to blog, again, these are my thoughts on blogs, but my HTML file that I've created is working perfectly. How awesome is that? And Flask uses this idea of templates to add multiple HTML files. So for example, I can create a new file. Let's just say duplicate here. So I'm going to duplicate this file and call it about.html. And this about.html is going to say about me. And let's go into server.py and have the root folder as index.html. And perhaps add another route, say about.html. And yes, I can do that as well. And in here, we'll grab the about.html. Let's call it whatever we want. Let's say about function. And if I go back, go to about, well, it's not going to work because remember I added the .html. There you go, about me. Awesome, this is great. We're starting to learn about different routes and how servers work. And we're able to send our HTML file. But what about the JavaScript files and the CSS files? How can we do that? In the next video, we'll find out. Welcome back. Let's figure out how to add CSS and JavaScript to, well, our index.html. Because if you remember, we are using script and CSS in here. Now, once again, with Flask, if we go to, let's say, CSS, we see that there's static files. Static files simply means it's a file that's never going to change. That is, CSS and JavaScript, usually once we send them out, they're not going to change. They're static. And you see over here that with Flask, we have to store the files on the file system as static/style.css. So we need to create a static folder. Again, this is something that you just have to get used to, but let's say in here, we'll create, just like we did with templates, we're going to create a static folder so that the Flask app knows to look in here for CSS and JavaScript files. So I'm going to move the JavaScript file to the static folder and do the same with the CSS file. So once again, move that to static. Now, if I just save this and run, you'll see that it won't actually work. Well, why is that? Can you figure it out? Again, because we haven't talked too much about HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Don't worry if you didn't get this. But if you remember, in our index.html file, we reference these files inside of here. But the file paths have now changed. They're now in the static folder like this. So I have to say static script.js. If I now go back and refresh, hey, look at that. My beautiful green website for, let's say this is Christmas website, is now working. If I open up the developer tools, go to network and refresh, hey, check that out. I have my document, then I have my JS file, and why is there no CSS? Let me refresh again. Oh, there it is, right over there. We have style, CSS, we have JS, and we have the document. Awesome. If you're wondering why we're getting this little favicon error, favicon is the little icon that shows up on tabs over here. So we can actually even add our own favicon if we wanted to and send images. And the way we would do that is to, again, in our endpoint, instead of the blog, I'm going to say favicon.ico for icon. And we can just send it an image. How will we go about doing this? I'm going to show you the answer in the next video, but I want you to give it a try and figure out how you can send an image back to this endpoint so that we don't get this error, and when a browser automatically requests for this, which all browsers do, it's going to show up a little icon over here for us. So pick whatever icon you want and see if you can solve it. In the next video, I'll show you the answer. Welcome back. Were you able to figure it out? I just Googled around for some free .ico icons, and I really like this lightning bolt one, so I've just downloaded it as an ICO, and now it's in my folder over here as bolt.ico. Now, how were you able to solve this? If your first instinct was to Google for it, well, good job. That's what you want to do as a developer. You see over here that, well, Flask has documentation on how we can use it. Now, there's two ways to do it. We have this link way and a way that works with older browsers as well. Now, this syntax might not be obvious to you, but let's use this method and then I'm going to show you what it actually does. So let's just copy and paste. So we go into our index.html, and in our link tag, I'm going to add this. So let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see, and maybe a little smaller so that everything is in here. And we see here that we have this syntax that we haven't seen before that's actually going to be used with Flask that we're going to talk about. But we see here that it's going to be for the static folder, and the file name is going to be favicon.ico. But mine is called bolt.ico, so let's just call it bolt.ico. That's the file name. And it should be in the static folder, so I'm going to move this into this static folder, just like that. Now, if I just save here, I can actually comment this out, hit save, and see what happens. If I go back to my website and I refresh, hey, look at that. Do you see how I have a little bolt here? You see that the bolt.ico is now on my website. How cool is that? And I didn't really do anything crazy. I didn't even have to have an endpoint, which is really cool. Again, Flask, because a favicon is something so common, just makes it super easy for us so we don't have to clutter our code with a favicon endpoint. So I can just remove this. But you know what? I'm not a big fan of doing things without understanding them. And right now, what we just did here seems really strange. Where is this URL for thing coming from? What's with this double squiggly lines? In the next video, we're going to find out what all of this means. Welcome back. What is this weird syntax? In order for us to understand that, we have to understand this idea of a templating language. You see, the power of Flask is the fact that we can build things dynamically. What do I mean by this? Well, let's assume that in the body tag here, I write 2 curly brackets like this. If I do in here 4 plus 5 and I save, let's go back to our website with our cool lightning bolt, and let me close this for now. If I refresh, I get 9. Is that what you expected? How is that possible? Because if you're wondering, this isn't HTML. If I did this in a regular HTML, it will just show the actual curly brackets 4 plus 5. But something is happening here. Flask looks at these double curly brackets and says, oh, this is an expression. This is a Python expression that I actually need to evaluate. And this is actually the exciting thing with Flask. Underneath the hood, it uses something called Jinja, a templating language. It's a way for us to do this, and Flask comes built in with that. So if we look at the favicon, what we just did is we've used Jinja to say, hey, I want you to evaluate this as Python. So if I copy this and I go to server.py, and in here, let's just do a print and paste this in. That is the exact same thing that we added to our HTML, except for we now need the URL for that comes with Flask. Let's move this here actually, inside of the route. If I refresh, I see over here that I get static bolt.ico. So it's printing the actual URL static/bolt.ico. Now, I could just technically have copy and pasted this and just done this whole thing as a string instead of using URL for. But if you go to the documentation of Flask, it talks about URL for and why it's a good idea to build a URL instead of hard coding them. And it gives you actual reason of why you might do that. For now, you can just think of it as a safer way to build URLs. So that's all we're doing. We're essentially saying grab the bolt.ico from the static folder. And we're able to do this through this templating language. Very, very cool. And now we have an extra power in our tool belt. That is, we're now able to dynamically update parts of the page. What do I mean by this? Imagine if our super cool website, when I actually refresh here, gives me the username of that person. For example, if I request for the blog of Andre and I hit run, ideally it'll say, hi Andre, and then maybe show my blog post. Using Flask, we can do that. And let's find out how to do that in the next video. Welcome back. Flask has this other tool called variable rules that we haven't talked about. And what variable rules allows us to do is to do something like this, dynamic. So for example, /user/ with these greater than and less than signs and the username. Now, we'll get back to this in a second and some of this syntax. But if we go back, what we can do here in our server.py is perhaps, let's remove this because we don't need it anymore. Inside of our hello world, let's say that we want name in here. Or in our case, username. Now, the neat thing is that Flask is going to look at this and say, oh, this is something that we can pass on into this function. So I can now say username equals the username that we receive. So let's say username. And let's just change this to name just so you see what the differences are. So I'm passing whatever I receive here into the hello world name parameter. And now in my index.html, I can pass on this data by simply doing a second parameter and saying name equals to name. So now if I save this, go back to my index.html and put in name in here. And if I go back to our homepage, if we go to our homepage, and I made a little mistake here, this should be over here. So it's saying username from up here is going to equal a default if we want. So it's usually a good idea to have a default. I'll just do none for now. So that username now is going to be username in here, like this. If I save, go back, I get a not found because we don't have a homepage anymore. But anytime I do, let's say, Andre, I get, look at that, Andre on my page. I get Bob and my good friend, Sally. How cool is that? So it's able to read the URL and pass in data this way. And if we go to our Flask documentation and we go to variable rules, you see that we have different rules that we can apply. For example, we can actually require to accept a positive integer or a string or a float, a path, so it accepts slashes, or something called UUID, which is kind of like a unique identifier. So let's try that. Let's do a post ID here, or in our case, let's just copy this and say I also want the username, and then perhaps accept some sort of a number. So instead of post ID, maybe it could be, I don't know. Actually, post ID is good. Let's keep it like that. And let's make this a little bit bigger. Now in here, the second parameter can be the post ID. That's going to equal to none to begin with. And we're also going to pass this as post ID. That's going to equal the post ID. If I save this, go to index.html, and in here, let's do name, and then we'll also do the post ID in here. If I save, go back, and I refresh, well, again, because we've made our URL very specific, we'll just have to give some sort of a number. And look at that, I have Sally2, so that's her second blog post, then the fifth blog post, so on and so forth. And if I do something that's not a number, so if I do some string, I get not found because I've made the rule using this syntax, so int with the colon, saying that this has to be an ID. And I passed data down this way. So now we've created a full-out server. We now are able to use URLs to communicate with the server and ask for specific data for it to receive. Our server, based on what URL parameters we give it, or endpoints, is able to decide what resource to send to the front end so that it can display the appropriate information. But we can also do something interesting, like perhaps when we submit a form, to actually send perhaps the user's name with the form, so that when we send back a thank you note, we can say, thank you, Andre, or thank you, whatever the username is. Very, very cool. Now, these variable rules, as you can see, there's a few of them, and you can read through the documentation. You might also notice this syntax here, which is the %, or %s, or %d. This is actually another feature of Python that you can read about. But again, it's not critical to your understanding of Python. For now, though, I think we have the basic skills necessary to start building our portfolio website. Because up until now, frankly, this website doesn't look that great. So starting in the next video, we're going to build a really, really cool website. Something that looks, well, more like this. So that by the end of it, we can have a fully fledged portfolio website. And even though it seems like you haven't learned that much yet, you actually have learned all the skills necessary to build something like this. Well, kind of. Let's go explore some more in the next video. Hey, welcome back. I want to take a quick second to talk about this idea of data transfer from servers to the browsers. Now, we saw that when we open the developer tools, we can go to the network tab and actually see what type of data gets sent from the server. And here we saw that there's different types, but we mainly talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But we also see that there's a few other types in here. If I click on, let's say, the HTML, there's this field called content type that says it's a text HTML file. Now, this is something quite important because it uses something called a MIME type, and it stands for Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions. Sounds very impressive, doesn't it? And you see here, and I'll link to this resource, and let's make this a little bit bigger, that browsers use this MIME type, not the file extension, to determine how to process a URL. So they look at the content type that our Flask app actually automatically sends to the browser to determine what to do with that file. So that they know, hey, is it an HTML file? Is it a CSS file? Is it a JavaScript file? Now, at the end of the day, all this data that we're transferring, it's all just text. But they can be in different forms, and the browsers can interact with them in different ways. For example, if we scroll all the way down here, we have different types, but we want to focus on the important MIME types for web developers. We have things such as plain text, we have CSS, we have HTML, we have JavaScript. So that if I go to the JavaScript file here, and I go to content type, I see that, yep, it's application JavaScript. And we see here that there's a little note about why it's application JavaScript here instead of text JavaScript. Either way, this way the browser knows I'm about to read a JavaScript file, do some certain things because it is a JavaScript file. Now, if we keep scrolling down, there's also image types. So again, if we look at the images, let's say the PNG, again, if we scroll down, we see that it's an image PNG. At the end of the day, it's actually text that we receive from the server, but in a way that it can be read as a PNG file. So based on this knowledge, websites work by sending all this data and letting the browser take care of, well, building the page for us. Now, so far we've only talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And usually that's how websites are displayed. But there's different ways that we can also use servers, such as what we call API endpoints. So right here, I have the swappy.co, which stands for the Star Wars API. And what it does, as you can see here, is it sends us data. So instead of displaying a web page, it just sends us information. So for example, if I copy this, like so, and then let's say we do people over here. So let's do people. If I hit enter, look at that. I get this data. And this content type is what we call JSON. And JSON is just this format of data that we can use in our applications. So again, a website might take this data and perhaps display the name Luke Skywalker on the front page. So this endpoint, instead of sending HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just sends us this JSON data. Because at the end of the day, all a server does is send some data, right? It serves data. We can send all sorts of things. For example, this RoboHash website, if I do, let's say, anything I want in here, and I hit enter, it sends me a random image of a robot. If I change anything in this endpoint, I get a different robot. So web developers and mobile developers use this idea of servers all around the world to try and grab information, grab data from a server and display something useful on a browser. And I hope this shows you the power that servers have. We can do anything. The options are limitless. And we can build all sorts of servers with Python to do all sorts of things for us. All right, let's get back to our portfolio website. Welcome back. So we've learned the basics of Flask. We understand what servers do, and we also know what browsers do. But let's be honest here, this is kind of boring. I mean, this is not impressive. If you show this to a possible employer, they're going to look at you like a crazy person. So let's actually build a nice looking portfolio just based on what we've learned up until now. Now, I have a little gift for you. That is the fact that you won't have to write your own HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because, again, this isn't a web development course. And luckily for us, if you Google anywhere online for something like free templates or HTML free templates, you can find some really nice looking websites that you can just use for free. For example, let's look at Universe over here, and I'll link to this resource so you can take a look for yourself as well. If I preview it, check that out. You have a nice little website or portfolio page that you can just use. How cool is that? And it's actually already tablet and mobile friendly. So everything is already pre-built for you. That's pretty cool, right? So how can we use this? Well, let's just download it. And by the way, as you follow along, you can actually use whichever one of these you want. But for now, let's just use the Universe one just because there's a little astronaut here. It looks pretty cool. Let's just download this and see what happens. All right, I get a little question saying, how do we want to download the template? In our case, we want to pick HTML. And there you go. We get a nice little zip folder, and now we have this downloaded. So let's open this up. And oh boy, that's a whole lot of files and folders. So what should we grab from here? Well, there's a few things. First, this is the sample page. We actually don't need this, so let's just move it to trash. Next, we have assets. These are, well, different assets for our page to work, such as the astronaut page. So we'll keep that around. And then we have our HTML pages, which we definitely need. And then it looks like we have some JavaScript files and CSS files. Now there's a .gz here, which is what we call a compressed file, a gzipped compressed file. So this is just a way for the server to send a file, or the JavaScript file, which you can see is 138 kilobytes, but in a compressed form, so 44 kilobytes. So this way we're sending less data to the front end. And then we also have something like map, which actually helps us during debugging. But in our case, we don't need to worry about this for now. So let's just remove all the gzipped and map files. So we'll move those to trash so that we only have one CSS file and one JavaScript file. And then all the other ones are HTML files for our different pages. Now what we're going to do is we're going to copy this and move it to our project folder. Remember this folder over here? So ideally we move the HTML files into the templates and the static files, that is the CSS and JavaScript files, and maybe the assets in here. So that is the images in here. So let's do that. I have my web server here. I'm going to first just copy and paste what we just copied. And let's move all our HTML files into our templates. And you know what? Let's remove our existing templates as well, because we don't need them anymore. We have the pretty HTML file now. And then just have all of these. We have a new index.html that is going to be a lot prettier than our old website, so we want to use that. So let's move all that into templates. And then let's do the JS and CSS file, as well as the assets folder into the static. Awesome. So now that we have that set up, let's go back to our project and look at that. We have a lot more HTML that we haven't written, but luckily it's already created for us. Now, the last bit of setup is that because we moved our files around, we need to adjust the links between the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all the asset files. So if we scroll, if we go to index.html, we see that we're looking for the favicon in assets favicon. But because this is in static folder, we have to add static in here. So let's find where else we're using the assets in here. All right, so it looks like, let's make this a little bit bigger. So it looks like here for our background image, we're once again looking for the space image, but that's, as we know, in the static folder. And let's see where else we have. Oh, we have over here as well. Let's do static. Let's keep going. Static. All right, everything is all good now. We have the static folder. Oh, and we have to make sure we add a slash in front of the dot. Dot just means current directory, and then look in the static folder. So let's go back. Make sure we do that for everything. There we go. And there we go. Now let's save this. And I don't think we're completely done yet, but for now, let's go into our server.py. And for our home route, let's remove what we've had before. And let's just call it my home function. That takes no parameters. And instead, it's just going to return for us our index.html with no passed in parameters. So let's save, go back to our page or my website, and see what we get when we refresh. All right, that's a pretty ugly website, but it looks like at least we're displaying something. But right away, we notice that, it looks like there's no CSS being applied. It looks like we have some HTML, but the links aren't working either. So once again, this is because we have to update the links between the files. So what we'll do is actually go back to index.html, and in the head tag, we see that we have our style sheet, our CSS file, but again, we have to update this to have it in the static folder, as well as the JavaScript file, which if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we have the JS file here, which once again will be in the static folder. All right, let's save and go back and see if that makes things better. Hey, look at that. That's pretty cool. Mind you, this looks a little big because I increased the size of my website by doing command plus and minus, just so we can see better. But that's pretty awesome. Now, if I click on, let's say, works, I get works.html does not exist. So how can we fix that? We already know how to do that, right? All we need to do is to update these different routes so that it points to the appropriate template. Now in the next video, I'll show you how to do that, but I want you to attempt to do this yourself because we've learned this by now. So try to make the website work exactly like we had it over here on our mashup templates, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, were you able to get that? If not, don't worry. Let's go over what we need to do to get everything on our profile working. So we obviously have an about.html page. So that can just stay the same as it is now. We can call it about. And if we copy and paste here, do another one. Let's say, what else do we have? We have work.html. So let's do work.html, which will be work.html. And let's just check that this works. I'm going to remove the old route just so we have the home, about, and work HTML. If I go back and let's go to home. Oh, looks like we have a bit of an error. And I did not change the function over here. You see that I have both about, so let's just call this work. If I go back and refresh, all right, let's go to works. Oh, it's works.html. Why isn't that working? That is because it should be works.html. Silly me. All right, let's go back. Let's refresh. Works. All right, works is working, but once again, the CSS is not being applied. If I go back and let's go to About Me is working as well, but the CSS isn't being applied. And we know why that is. Once again, if we go to Works, we have to update this to include the static folder. Awesome. And then we update the CSS page as well as the JavaScript page. So this is a lot of repetition, but I'm just showing you so you understand what the thought process is and why we need to do this. Again, we'll just fix these as well. And this one. I feel like I should have a song in the background as I do this so you don't get bored of me just doing this over and over. But repetition is good, right? All right, last one, the JavaScript file. Let's save. Go back to our server. Let's refresh. All right, let's go to home. Uh-oh, looks like index.html is not working. So we got to fix that as well. We have the route directory that's working. If I click on works, looks like the CSS didn't work. Let's see About Me. About Me is working, so we missed something in works. If we go back to, and that's because we have a work and works HTML. So we have to make sure that we incorporate the works HTML instead of the work one. I'm not sure what this page does, but I'm sure it's part of this. So again, going into our works HTML, doing the same thing we've been doing, adding the static. Like so. And all the way at the bottom for the JavaScript file as well. Let's go back, go to works, and hooray, look at that. All our works are being displayed, but it looks like some of the images are not displaying. Now, can you guess why that is? Well, if we go back to our works HTML and we look for images, we see that here we have to add the static as well. So again, I'll add those to the images, and just to make this faster, I'll just copy this and do Command F or Control F to search for all instances of images and make sure that we add the assets in here. An easy way of doing this, and this is what an IDE can help you with, or a text editor like Sublime Text, is I can select the entire thing like this and do Command Control G. And this actually selects all the instances. And I have now multiple cursors. Now what I can do now is just add the static on all the instances, as you can see at the bottom and the top here as well, so that I don't have to repeat myself. Now let's go back, refresh, and look at that. We have our projects displaying. That's really, really cool. And just like that, we have our templates. Now we still have the components that we need to fix and the contact. Now, the components we actually don't need, because if you go to the preview here, the components is just an HTML template that you can just copy and paste based on what components you need, but we don't actually need that on our real portfolio. The only other one that we need is the contact page, which is really, really important because we're gonna use that for our Python server. So let's go back here let's remove the components.html. Or for now, we can just keep it there, but in the index.html file, we can go all the way down. And in the navigation bar section, you see over here how we have the components.html. We can just remove that, just like that. So we're not using it. Now, one thing you may have seen me do is copy and paste code, so that now we would have to do another route that says contact, and then once again do contact. But this is us repeating code. Based on what we've learned, can we improve this so this becomes more dynamic, so that maybe when we add a new HTML file to this profile, we don't have to constantly just copy and paste the same code over and over? Try that, and in the next video, I'll show you how we can do that. Welcome back. Let's make this a little bit more dynamic. We have our home route, but for all the other HTML pages, it'll be nice if this was generated dynamically so that we don't have to copy and paste code. So let's delete all of these and instead use this little syntax that we learned about, where we can dynamically accept different URL parameters. In this case, we can just call it page name. And this page name should be a string, right? So now we can use the string type to say, I want the page name. So this is going to be HTML page. And we want to render in the template the data that was entered in the URL. So we can actually give it the page name here as the input and print out the page name here. Let's see if this works. I'm going to save this, go back to our homepage, and it works. What if I do works? Yeah, look at that. If I go to About Me works. Contact. All right, contact is working, but the CSS isn't being applied, so we have to update that. And we still see the components. All right, so there's a few things that we need to fix, but everything is working dynamically, which is great. And you see that even index.html that we had issues with before is now working, which is great. So let's fix a few things. We've now made our code super simple and easy to understand. But there's a few bugs that we need to fix in our code. First is to remove the components. Now, the reason this is happening is that each page, if we scroll up to the top, so let's go to the About page, has the components link. So from each page, we just have to remove the components. So let's go to Contact, remove the components here. Go to Index, we've already removed the components for that one. If I go to Work, Work is a little bit different. We'll get back to that in a second. If we go to Works, and again, at the top in the navigation, the components we can just remove, just like that. We also saw that the contacts page doesn't have CSS added to it. So again, we go back and we add the static folder here. Same with the favicon. Right over here. And then the JavaScript file at the bottom. If we save, go back, let's refresh, and go to Home. If we go to Works, that works. About Me, that works. Contact, look at that. How pretty is that? All right. Now, a few things that I want to fix here. One is that we see that the numbers don't match over here. We want them to ideally match, right? So we have this working, but then About Me and Contact, that's kind of weird. Let's see why that is. If we go back, we go to Contact, we see that in the navigation, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, which looks great. But then at the bottom, we see that the numbers Contact Me are a little bit off. So let's just do 04 for contact me. If we go to about, making sure that the about page or about me is 03. So let's do that. And now if I save and refresh, we have contact me, about me, works, and home. All right, 2 last things, and then we're going to get back to Python, I promise. One, I want to change this text so that it says my name, and maybe I'm a Python developer. So all we have to do is, once again, go to index.html and look for this text. Add your site or app content here. So we can see here it says, hello, I'm James Dean, French designer. So let's just say I'm Andre Nagoy. And let's say Python. Let's say expert. Sounds cooler. Working as a freelancer. Let's do an instructor, because I am an instructor after all. So that if I save and refresh, how awesome is that? Super, super simple. That looks pretty neat. All right, the last thing is the works part. If you look at my works and I click on discover, all right, so here you can add your own projects that you want. If I go to 06, I guess the links here aren't working since we only have one work. But let's say you wanted to add a different project. All we have to do is simply say work2.html and link in 002 here with work2. Let me show you how that's done. So let's go to work.html. If we do Control F and do 002, we see that these are the links. Look at that, 002, 003. So all we have to do is perhaps change the link here to work2.html so that it links to work2. Now, that's something that you can do on your own. Again, we don't want to focus too much on HTML and CSS because it's outside the scope of this course. But as you can see, we have a pretty neat website, pretty fast. It only took us a couple of minutes, and you now have a portfolio webpage. But there's one big piece missing, and one thing that Python can really help us with. That is this contact form. It wouldn't be a real portfolio website unless people can contact you, right? Maybe employers or people that need work done can actually send you a message. So over the next couple of videos, we're actually going to explore this, where we're able to send information to our server in the backend and actually capture it and save it and store it somewhere. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.